Hi, I'm Tom with a list of interesting things. Today I want to talk about voting. In places like Costa Rica and Belgium, voting is mandatory. They don't say that you can't vote for dead gorillas, but they do say you have to vote. In places like Puerto Rico, Election Day is a public holiday, meaning every individual is off and they can have election night parties just like any rational person would. But in the United States at large, voting is generally hard. General Election Day is mandated by law to be on a Tuesday. Most individuals have things to do on a Tuesday. Local boards of elections and other election authorities might have funding and administrative challenges in setting up polling locations. Polling locations may be few and far between, causing there to be lines and crowds, both of which are particular issues now in the coronavirus. Voting in America has been consistently challenging over the years, and historically, individuals and organizations have attempted to make voting harder, usually for groups likely to vote against them. As a result, intentional and unintentional challenges have cropped up over the years, and voter turnout in the United States has been historically low. But relatively recently, strides have been made and ideas put forth to make voting easier and more accessible and to get voter turnout to rise. So today we're going to go over some of these methods by which natural and artificial challenges have been put in front of voters. And, on the list of interesting political things, we're going to discuss some voting methods and turnout measures that help people get out to vote. Let's dive right in. Now, before we start, a disclaimer. No voting system is perfect. Everyone has flaws, and everyone has potential exploitations that can be accessed. We'll touch on those, but the purpose of this video is not to shake faith in the voting system, but to point out historical flaws and exploitations, and to discuss the measures that have been taken and are now being taken to overcome them. Alright, let's go. Voting can be broadly divided into three methods. We'll start with in-person voting. Historically, this has been quite straightforward. It's the oldest and the simplest. You go to a polling place on a given day, they hand you a ballot that looks something like this, you take it behind a screen or into a room, and you fill it out. Nice and straightforward. Today, this includes in-person paper voting and in-person digital voting, and sometimes a combination of the two. Because in-person voting is considered the default, and because it's been around the longest, it's the method in which organizations have had the longest to explore problems, and the longest to go about fixing them. It's also, unfortunately, the run through which individuals have had the longest to invent and perfect creative methods of voter suppression. Issues include location and ease of access of polling locations. Polling locations, like many things, cost money to operate. They must be staffed and heated, the staffs must be trained, and there's a certain amount of advertising money that has to go into letting voters know where the polling locations are. And taxpayers, quite notably, do not like spending money. As in all things, money is always an issue. A balance must be struck between the federal government and the state government. Does the federal government choose to allocate funds to rural Kansas, where perhaps they are in more desperate need of increased polling locations, or large, bustling California, where you're likely to help more individual people per dollar spent? A balance must also be struck between the local governments who administer the funds and state governments who must likewise allocate it. The government of Virginia must decide if it's more of a priority to bring more polling locations to super rural Tazewell, where there might be few polling locations in general, or much busier Richmond, where perhaps fewer people have vehicles to transport themselves to the polling locations. Similar trade-offs need to be made in the issues of things like poll opening times. Let's not forget that the election takes place on a Tuesday, noted for being in the bottom 2 days of the week. Some places have quite strict polling locations and closing times, sometimes as late as 7 a.m. to as early as 6 p.m. on Election Day. If you're a working parent of 3 living paycheck to paycheck, you might just be unable to justify taking the time off work to go to the polls and vote during those times. By contrast, my boys in my home state of New York have quite liberal opening times and closing times, going 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., making it much easier to justify taking an hour right at the end or right at the beginning to make it to the polls. There's also distance to polling location, as I touched on briefly. If you live in a major city without a well-designed public transport system, you may be faced with a 2, 3, or 4-mile walk on Election Day. If you're elderly or disabled, this may make it functionally impossible for you to get there. Now, these issues have, generally speaking, been unintentional. Polling location restrictiveness is mostly the result of poor funding rather than malice, and poll opening and closing times are dependent on legislative red tape and getting reliable volunteers. but intentionally influencing groups or individuals not to vote is something that the United States is accustomed to as well. Let's talk about some of the more well-known examples of this problem, called voter suppression. Then we'll discuss some of the more subtle examples in the modern day. In the 1880s and 90s, following the passage of the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to all men regardless of race, including former slaves, voter suppression in the South, mostly by Democrats, skyrocketed. Initially, turnout among newly freed African Americans was quite high, but as a few election cycles started to pass, Southern white leaders developed more and more methods by which voters' rights, particularly black voters' rights, could be curtailed. These methods included poll taxes, fees that needed to be paid before an individual could cast a ballot. They also included literacy tests, sometimes called voter application tests, which were exams given to voters before they were allowed to vote. Some of them were designed to test a voter's reading level, like this one from Mississippi in the 50s. And some, like this Alabama literacy test from Ferris State University in Big Rapids, Michigan, were designed to be as difficult as possible. I'd love to know how many people watching this right now could tell me the presidential and senatorial inauguration days off the top of their heads. I'll leave a link to this whole test in the citations. Take a look. It is appalling. It's easy to see how a poll tax could disproportionately affect African Americans in the late 19th century, given that they were overwhelmingly poor former slaves. Similarly, given that education was overwhelmingly unfavorable toward African Americans, literacy was fairly uncommon. And let's not beat around the bush. This is not a test designed to assess your skill with the English language or your knowledge of U.S. governmental affairs. This is a test designed to be failed, pure and simple. This kind of overt government-sponsored voter suppression was a part of the well-studied Jim Crow laws. They caused voter turnout, overwhelmingly black voter turnout, to suppress and stay suppressed, all the way through the 1960s and 70s until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Voter suppression tactics like this may seem fairly antiquated relative to today, but they are definitely not. I'd like to call attention to a specific incident from 1981 New Jersey. In the gubernatorial election that year, the Republican National Committee employed so-called ballot security measures. These included, quite famously, the Ballot Security Task Force, which was comprised largely of off-duty police officers. The task force patrolled on Election Day in majority black and Hispanic neighborhoods with the supposed intention of protecting the integrity of the ballots, but having the result of intimidating voters throughout the state. Voters were threatened and sometimes physically accosted, resulting in marked reduction in Democratic turnout in those majority-minority neighborhoods. And it's worth noting that in a 2 million vote election, the Republican candidate won by less than 2,000 votes. In 1982, the DNC sued the RNC for the use of these intimidation tactics. The RNC ended up settling, and in the process signed a consent decree, promising to refrain from, quote, engaging in activities that suppress the vote, particularly when it comes to minority voters. I bring up this case in particular because that decree expired in 2017. In the succeeding 3 years, there has been a groundswell of support for so-called ballot security measures in the 2020 general election, including but not limited to the use of sheriffs and concerned citizens to, quote, monitor the polls. This is reminiscent of, and even uses similar phrasing to, the 1981 New Jersey case. I'm sure you can understand how a young minority voter might be cautious about going to vote when the doors to their polling location is flanked by off-duty sheriffs carrying loaded pistols. Well, that's depressing enough for right now. Let's talk about the myriad things that have been done to combat some of these things. There are, of course, the broad fixes, things like universal blanket voting rights expansions through the 15th, 19th, and 24th Amendments. There have also been smaller efforts on state levels to increase voter turnout. Things like extending polling hours and heavily restricting poll intimidation tactics. Furthermore, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, 43 states and the District of Columbia have enacted some form of early vote. This may be as simple as Oklahoma, which allows 5 days of voting before Election Day, or as expansive as what we see in Alabama, which allows in-person absentee 55 days before the election. There's also this very new and very exciting phenomenon of drive-through voting in places like Texas, hoping to help people avoid the long lines and big crowds of Election Day. And of course, there's popular efforts through local parties and organizations, things like civics teachers offering extra credit to students who register, as well as local parties and ride-sharing companies offering free rides to the polls on Election Day. I'd like to touch one more time on that in-person absentee that I mentioned a moment ago, because it actually serves as an excellent segue into the next type of voting. This one is relatively new and has historically been fairly rarely utilized, but has recently been thrust into the public consciousness. This is distance paper voting. This includes mail-in, absentee, and drop-off voting. They're all more or less the same thing. Absentee is voting with an excuse at some time other than on a designated election day. This was started way back in the Civil War, and the excuses are usually medical or service-related, but many states have laws that will allow a voter to fill out an absentee application for pretty much any reason. Absentee voting can be done in person or by mail, depending on the state and local ordinances. Some states have seen such success with absentee voting that they've expanded it, usually under the heading of mail-in voting. They've removed the excuse requirement and said anyone can vote by mail for any reason if they so choose. In fact, 5 states, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Utah, and Hawaii, have chosen to do voting entirely or nearly entirely by mail. And then, of course, there's drop-off absentee voting, which is, again, just what it sounds like. Individuals fill out a ballot at home and drop it off at a designated location, usually in a collection box like this or at community centers like schools and churches. On the less pleasant side, there have been attempts to restrict, influence, and defraud distance paper voting, though these have historically been less common than those of in-person voting. The most commonly understood, and especially recently, is the concept of ballot collection or ballot harvesting. This is where an individual or group collects a ballot or series of ballots and either changes the votes or discards the ballots entirely. There have been isolated incidents of this, usually by family members voting on behalf of infirm or absent voters. But there's no evidence that this type of fraud has ever been committed on a large scale. We've referenced it before, but I'd like to call attention to the memo by FBI Director Christopher Wray earlier this year. Quote, "We have not seen historically any kind of coordinated national voter fraud effort in a major election, whether it's by mail or otherwise. We have seen voter fraud at the local level from time to time, so my comments should in no way be construed as minimizing how seriously we take our responsibility to investigate such incidents." He's not saying that it doesn't happen, and neither am I, but it's very rare, isolated, and generally quite easy to catch. Speaking of the contemporary, there have been a few efforts lately to curtail drop-off absentee voting as well. Just this week, Governor Abbott of Texas limited ballot drop-off locations to just 1 per county. 1. That brings to mind the same issues presented with polling locations. If you live in Houston and you don't have a car, it may be functionally impossible for you to walk from one side of Houston to the other to drop your ballot off. I'm sure you can understand that this is the sort of thing that would disproportionately affect younger, low-income, and minority individuals. Similarly, there have been lawsuits filed by the Trump campaign against Pennsylvania's State Department that challenged, among other things, the number of polling boxes in the state and the requirement that poll watchers be resident of their local counties. Unfortunately, this type of thing is attempted all the time. Political parties and organizations attempt to subtly influence policy such that voting becomes slightly harder for people likely to vote against them. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I'm afraid I don't have much hopeful to say about this, as it's ongoing. The best I can say is that measures like this are being fought against even as we speak. Now I want to talk about one final kind of voting method, and we'll talk about it only briefly because it is not currently in the use in the United States. Distance digital voting. Distance digital voting is just what it sounds like. It's voting over the internet, using things like smartphones and computers. And it's in use around the world in varying levels of implementation in places like Australia and India. Normally I wouldn't really touch on this, but some states have really been considering it, because This is not a computer science video. We're going to vastly oversimplify, but I do want to go into it a little bit. Your computer is hooked up to the internet, which communicates with a server, presumably at your local board of elections. That server asks you who you'd like to vote for. You send an answer back, and bam, you've voted just like that. This voting method has been very popular among the youngest generation of voters, who say that they would be much more likely to vote if voting became more convenient. Now that's a sentiment with which I wholeheartedly agree. But that's actually exactly the reason that I get giddy as a schoolboy who just opened a pack of Pokemon cards when I see that Texas is rolling out drive-through voting. But with the plan as a whole, I strongly disagree. The issue with voter fraud can be boiled down to a simple concept. Who has access to the ballots? In standard in-person voting, about 3 to 5 people have access to the ballots. The voter, the person who carries the ballots out of the voting hall, and the person or people who count them. With mail-in voting, you add a few more people to that chain. The mailman who picks up the mail, the one who sorts the mail, and the one who delivers it to the Board of Elections. In either of these cases, it's relatively difficult to influence the result of a single ballot. You need to intimidate a voter, or steal a ballot out of a mailbox, or bribe a poll worker, or threaten a mailman. And because it's difficult to commit that kind of election interference on a small scale, it becomes very difficult to commit it on a large scale. Difficult and obvious, like the Jim Crow laws or like the Ballot Security Task Force. But as soon as you link that server up to the internet, as soon as that server becomes connected, every single person on the planet has access to that chain. The results become immediately unreliable because every single human being in every single country in the world has access to them. And now you may say that's true, but they'll have extremely good cybersecurity, the likes of Bank of America or Google, to protect the data. And you'd be right, but there's no lock in the world that's uncrackable. And as we saw, more money than several nations did not stop Twitter from letting 38 million lines of data get accessed. Much though I'd like it, much though I'd love it, distance digital voting is just not ready. Until we manage to make uncrackable locks in the digital world, there will always be the active danger that one clever nerd, just one, could crack in and add a 25% multiplier to the number of votes. And unlike physical protections like we have now, that clever nerd could run that program from the comfort of their own living room in Tallahassee or Montreal, or somewhere like Beijing where there are no extradition treaties. So, to summarize, there are 2 principal ways to vote. In person by going to a polling location, or at a distance by mailing in a ballot or dropping it off. Both of these are very reliable. Not uncrackably reliable as we've demonstrated, but reliable. There is another, digital voting, which may be safe someday, but today is not. In every episode of Interesting Political Things, and in this one in particular, you'll find links below on how to register to vote, how to find out how to vote by mail, and how to find out who's running in your upcoming elections. I encourage you to vote. There are some people and organizations who benefit from low voter turnout. People who want you to stay home and stay disengaged. They're the ones who tell you that your vote doesn't matter. They're the ones who tell you that it's not worth worrying about. Don't listen to those people, I implore you. Vote. Do it safely, do it carefully, and do it any way you can. Because it's the most important and most impactful thing a citizen can do. No matter who you are, no matter what you believe in, please vote. I hope you'll subscribe to stay up to date on all the most interesting things. And until next time, be like voting methods. Be creative, be varied, and be unassailably good. Be flawed, but be constantly improving. And above all, be interesting. I'll see you next time.